just happen to have with me, a article, a statement. It's called One Medicine, and it's a statement by Professor Wesley Mills at McGill University, May 1893. Quote, "Some will elect to treat lower animals and some mankind, but there is only one science and art of medicine, and all of the various bodies of workers in this vast field should form but different battalions of one great army, fighting for the prolongation of vigorous life and the mitigation of pain in every quarter to which the power of man can reach." I don't know any other way to say it.
1893. That is 120 years ago. Just 30 years after the American Veterinary Medical Association was founded. I chose to open this film about the history of wildlife and ecosystem health with Dr. Barney Easterday's recitation of Professor Wells' statement because it surprised me. What I realized from that eloquent, timeless statement that fills me with great pride for the profession is that the vision for the role of veterinarians in all aspects of medicine, be it animal, human, or ecosystem health, was there. And it has been all along. This is the story of where we have been, where we are now, and where I think we all hope to be in the future. The stories are real. Those interviewed are among my heroes. The time for the preservation of all things bright and beautiful is now.
In my day and age, veterinary medicine was, okay, you were going to practice and maybe do meat inspection, something like that. But there were, that's a long time ago. That sort of the vision was pretty narrow.
Dr. Easterday graduated from Michigan State University College of Veterinary Medicine in 1952. At the time, the role of the veterinarian was primarily to care for large animals. Equine medicine was still a prominent factor in the career. Although the majority of veterinarians practiced rural medicine similar to Dr. Easterday, some were involved in wildlife medicine. The main facet of the field was not to manage and treat free-ranging wildlife. Rather, it was to serve as veterinarian for captive wild animals housed in zoos. A major milestone was the development of the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians. This association was formed in 1946 by 3 veterinarians who congregated at the annual AVMA convention in Boston that year. The AAZV started with 3 members and now has thousands of members. The goals of the newly established association were to provide guidelines for the proper veterinary medical care of animals living in zoos and other forms of captivity. So the first form of wildlife medicine practiced in the United States was zoological medicine. Part of the reason that veterinarians were not engaging in caring for free-ranging wildlife was because the infrastructure wasn't tailored to veterinarians. There were wildlife biologists involved in observing and studying wildlife diseases, but not necessarily treating them. As we will hear from Dr. Tom Ewell, it took drastic changes to bring wildlife medicine to the attention of the national government.
The Fish and Wildlife Service, at least the Washington headquarters, didn't believe in the importance of wildlife diseases much. And it took a spectacular outbreak of duck plague in Lake Andes National Wildlife Refuge in South Dakota with tremendous mortality. There's this great picture of one of their field teams standing by a pile of 5,000 dead, mostly ducks and a few Canada geese. And that led from what had been this very small lab in Patuxent, where I started out, to the establishment of the National Wildlife Health Center, which is, of course, now down the road from you guys there in Madison. And some of the struggles in getting it started, but Milt was the founding director, and he had to undergo the attacks on the lab from Washington, and some of us helped fend those off politically. That little wildlife disease lab at Patuxent, where I worked as a student slave, was focused almost exclusively on parasites, and they just had a couple of professional parasitologists. Later, they acquired a veterinary pathologist, but they really didn't have an national scope. They sort of, because of the limitations, just would sort of focus on targets of opportunity. They weren't structured to handle it. They sort of threw a team together, and Milt Friend was the leader of it, but it was that catastrophe, and it was so dramatic and visible that was really what launched the National Wildlife Health Center and finally made people recognize that the Fish and Wildlife Service, in order to meet their responsibilities, had to be able to develop that capability so that they could know what's going on and not sort of limp along from one catastrophe to another.
The National Wildlife Health Center was established in 1975. This is right around the same time that veterinary medical schools began providing opportunities to include wildlife topics in the curriculum and in advanced training. The University of California at Davis was the first veterinary medical school to establish a zoological medicine program, and the first zoological medicine internships program started at San Diego Zoo the same year, which was 1968. I think it is clear that wildlife and ecosystem health has emerged as a reputable and important field. One of the most important factors in this process is the increased role of the veterinarian in many diverse aspects of wildlife and ecosystem health. The American Association of Wildlife Veterinarians was founded in 1979. This organization strives to link veterinarians into every aspect of wildlife medicine and have established guidelines for veterinarians working in wildlife and ecosystem health conservation field medicine. The interest and opportunities for those who want to pursue a career in this field have grown astronomically. Whereas there were only 3 veterinarians in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when it was established in the 1930s, and only a handful of veterinarians working at the National Wildlife Health Center when it was founded, now there are wildlife vets working in all sorts of places. There are wildlife vets working in zoos, of course, and there are veterinarians working as government agents at national parks, and there are vets working at academic institutions studying and treating emerging wildlife diseases. It's an exciting time to be getting into this field. As we learn more about the connections between wildlife health and other factors, such as the health of pets, livestock, and even humans, more veterinary medical students have become interested in pursuing a career in wildlife and ecosystem health. The veterinary medical schools have encouraged these interests in abundant ways. For example, nearly all veterinary medical schools in the United States have wildlife or special species clinics. Many have well-established connections with nearby zoos, rehabilitation centers, and national parks. The veterinary medical schools have also been strong proponents of the development of the One Health concept and the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration to address the many complex issues involving ecosystem health. Veterinary medical students acquire a broad educational experience, making us very capable of working in many different fields. Dr. Easterday elaborates this concept next.
In that 4 years of veterinary medical education, that you develop the skills that help you to participate in this sort of whole One Health scheme to address the health problems of all creatures, great and small. Sort of, if I go back 50 years, maybe wildlife medicine was a sort of, was a kind of new era, at least for me. And then to understand and to watch the evolution of that as people began to have the opportunity to study the various kinds of diseases that were occurring in wild populations and so forth. And not only here in this part of the world, but all over the world. And to watch the sort of the discovery on this campus of sort of the veterinary medical science people and the wildlife ecology people discovering each other to say, we have a lot in common, and together we can make things happen. And and then along with that is the gee whiz, wildlife health, wildlife disease are very important in our system. Well, ecosystem health only, and particularly in the last few years as the Institute for Global Health has evolved on this campus, to watch the people from various units on the campus, from medicine and public health, from veterinary medicine, from nursing, from pharmacy, from agriculture, etc. Hey, we're all into this together. We have a lot in common. And gee whiz, this is really interesting. And we need to be sure that we think about each other and work with each other as we pursue these problems. That is, that no one of us has all the abilities, knowledge, etc., to attack this.
Dr. Easterday mentioned the Global Health Institute, which is a relatively new institution at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The aims of the program are to provide health professional students with the opportunities to interact with one another to address global health problems. Wildlife disease discussion enjoys a prominent role in many of these discussions. Students can also obtain certificates in global health through this program and pursue various study abroad opportunities over their summer breaks. Dr. Tony Goldberg sits on the leadership team as the Associate Director for Research, and he is a veterinary wildlife epidemiologist. This example of interdisciplinary teamwork has inspired many other collaborative efforts on the campus. Dr. Tom Ewell, a wildlife biologist who specializes in infectious diseases, was one of the developers of the Global Health Institute. He discusses the changes he has seen in the field of wildlife and ecosystem health, and where he continues to see prominent roles for wildlife veterinarians in ongoing diseases affecting both wild and domesticated animal populations.
Just the general awareness of diseases in wildlife populations has increased tremendously, and it is, I think, reflected in the number of states that now have wildlife veterinarians. The National Wildlife Health Center has served as a model and provided the justification for making those kinds of commitments. The Wildlife Disease Association, which started out with a handful of us in the early 60s and has now, what was the last count? 800, 900 members. And we had our annual conference in Lyon, France, the biggest ever, with 500 people in attendance. Strong European Nordic group. Latin America is coming aboard with a section there. Australia has always been pretty active. So the whole field has really gone global. So there are all these things that come along, and the controversies that require science to back them up are still going on. You think of things like brucellosis and elk and bison in the greater Yellowstone area, and that's still playing out. And duck plague still keeps popping up, and so there, I think in most now Fish and Game agencies, state and federal, they recognize that diseases are an important component of the ecosystem they're concerned about.
So the concept of veterinarians collaborating with other wildlife health professionals was catching on, but this process hasn't always been smooth. Dr. Val Beasley, Professor Emeritus from the University of Illinois College of Veterinary Medicine, provides an interesting story from his early days as a wildlife toxicologist.
When I started into this field, not long after that, the term ecosystem health came up, And I started using it. It made sense to me. And I took a beating about that at some meetings.
Really?
I just hated the term. And but it's been important. These people they had resentment toward medical doctors, some of them, and suggesting that they have almost omniscient data about this patient. The human patient is a finite organism, has basically a skin, and so things are closely regulated inside that in terms of homeostasis with this ion concentration and that heart rhythm and so forth. And ecosystems are wide open. They don't have the skin. They have fuzzy borders, and we don't have enough knowledge like they do about human medicine to do anything. And it just went on and on. And they went on and on about values. This infers values, and who are you to tell us what our values should be about ecosystems? But over time, I think it's become evident that we do have preferences. We do have values about how ecosystems work as well. And we do have some knowledge about, we do have a lot of things in common. One woodland ecosystem has a lot in common with another nearby woodland ecosystem. And the same thing with a prairie or an estuary. And to suggest that we can't measure things because we have preferences as to outcomes, there's something wrong with that. I think it fell under its own weight. And so the term ecosystem health is not one that has hurt the field. I think it's helped the field. And as we have come now more toward what's called One Health, and this is, in my mind, still in its infancy, we're at a point where people that are concerned about human populations, people that are concerned about public health, people that are concerned about wildlife health, domestic animal populations, and ecosystems, we're seeing that there are tremendous overlaps. The emergence of infectious diseases, not just influenza strains, but SARS and Ebola, Nipah virus, so many of them that come from wildlife to domestic animals and people, and things that have happened where huge impacts on wildlife have come from domestic animals, like rinderpest, which is a cow disease. It's hard on cattle, worse on hoofed livestock, and now it's eradicated from the planet, thank God, by virtue of vaccination of cattle. Things like HIV/AIDS, different strains have come from chimps or monkeys to people, and probably in relation to bushmeat. We've seen enough catastrophes, and with things like mercury poisoning, which in minimum amount of eight first affected the fish and then the birds, the water birds, and then the cats and people, where we share toxic exposures and things move up the food chain. Algal toxins, people are affected by it. If you look at the ecosystem, it's affected first. There are so many obvious connections now that are apparent that weren't so apparent, in the early to mid 90s when we started environment.
We just heard from Dr. Val Beasley, who as a veterinarian has been a leader in the development of the field of wildlife toxicology. Perhaps one of his greatest contributions to the field was his development of the EnviroVet program, which began in the 1990s. The goal of the EnviroVet program is to provide veterinary medical students and veterinarians with an 8-week-long multi-site course. The following quote off the EnviroVet website shows how important and how wonderful this program truly is. Quote, "Our vision is active, cohesive, impassioned, and effective multidisciplinary teams of health and environmental professionals working together to ensure the sustainability of animals, humans, and ecosystems. Our mission is to educate, inform, engage, and inspire veterinarians of all backgrounds and nationalities to become integral members of teams protecting animal, human, and ecosystem health in the one living world we share." What a fabulous organization EnviroVet truly is. The strategy of the EnviroVet program is to provide students with a sound basis in the important aspects of wildlife and ecosystem health, and then to provide them with the opportunity to use those learned skills in a developing country. In addition to EnviroVet, a multitude of other programs have become available. MARVET is an organization that offers a number of summer workshops that cover topics ranging from sea turtle medicine to dolphin health assessment projects. These opportunities provide students with tremendous chances not only to get to learn medical skills to apply to wildlife medicine, but also to see firsthand the success that ensues when veterinarians collaborate with other health professionals. For example, this past summer I had the pleasure of participating in a MARVET course focused on dolphin medicine and conservation. The most exciting component of this workshop was getting to experience firsthand what it means to work on a collaborative project. In this project, the scientists worked as an ongoing collaborative team to assess the health of dolphins living in the Indian River Lagoon off the east coast of Florida. There were over 60 collaborators working on this project over the years that this project was going through. It was a truly amazing experience and a testimony that collaboration yields great outcomes. Dr. Raymond Tarpley, the developer of the MARVET program, speaks next about the changes he has seen in the approach to wildlife and ecosystem health throughout the years.
Put it in the context particularly of wildlife and exotics. Learning in veterinary school was mainly in the context of zoological parks and other facilities, game ranches, that are something under human management. Actually, we might look at it in a herd health type format or an individual treatment and whatnot, but it is still contained within an artificial environment. And we weren't addressing free-ranging wildlife as much. A lot of that was being handled by the biologists and the ecologists, and we weren't interacting with that discipline group as much as we have. So I think that's the big thing that's changed. Now we're seeing veterinarians get out, of the stricture in that way and step into full ecosystem environments and talk about health and disease dynamics in those contexts, and actually start a dialogue, conversation with biologists and ecologists and so on, so that the expertise can be shared, because there's going to be a knowledge base in both professions, you might say, that are relevant to the bigger solutions that have to evolve from this. And vets working in isolation, biologists working in isolation. So I think the gravity of what's happening these days in a global sense has precipitated this need to have disciplines work together.
Similar to Dr. Tarpley, Dr. Beasley elaborates on the changes that he has seen, in particular in zoo medicine.
But I've seen changes happen. Zoos have changed, and they want to continue to change in this direction, and that is from being places that can be criticized as a menagerie to places that are actually all about conservation. And yeah, they house some animals so that people can see them up close, but recognize that they are also learning from those animals as to how to manage their health, how to keep them from being stressed out, what their blood values indicate, what drugs to use on them to immobilize them, how to move them. And this feeds back to the wild populations. Also, they work toward maintaining genetic diversity in the captive animals, and they can learn a bit about how to do that in the wild as well from corollary studies. And they increasingly don't have one foot nailed to the floor. They go to the ranges where these animals live and assess their health out there and participate in their conservation, addressing a whole host of problems, helping people develop the skills to move them safely to open habitat where they used to be, where they should be again, helping ensure that they are less likely to catch some infection along the way from domestic animals or people, or something has crept into the area that hasn't historically been there before. So it's much more of a public educational institution these days. The larger zoos are and a research institution than it ever was before. So that's an ongoing change that I think is critically important.
Clearly, a lot has changed and developed in wildlife and ecosystem health. Dr. Tony Goldberg points out what might be ultimately the largest change to this field.
This field wasn't really a field. So the conservation medicine, eco-health, I call it the eco-health paradigm didn't exist. So people, there were forward thinkers, people like Tom Wool, Barney Easterday, and Val Beasley, who recognized that there was this important association between ecology and health. Mm-hmm. And yet, the field of infectious disease ecology or health ecology or conservation medicine really hadn't coalesced yet. So I've been lucky enough to see it come together. And now there are organizations, journals, granting agencies specifically targeting this area, this intersection of ecology and health. And that just wasn't the case when I started. So I guess the biggest change I've seen is that this field became a field over the last 20 years or so. Yeah. And other than that, there